Hey guys, another bonus video today. I've been sent a game in the giant hunting philosophy that we've been trying to pursue this week. This is from one of my students who's rated mid 800s and is taking on an opponent rated over 1,000. I haven't been through the game, so I'm going to be going through it at the same time as you. So let's just dive in and see how the game goes. So we're starting with d4, d5 and f4, signalling the London system. Knight to f3 is also an option at this point. Okay, knight to d4, the pawn on knight to c6, looking at the pawn on d4, but that's protected by the queen. And now c3, and normally general rule in the London is to play e3 before c3. Bishop comes out now, so we've got both bishops out and we've completed the pyramid in the London. Knight to f6 and now bishop to d3. So the bishops are facing off. If bishop takes, we'll recapture the queen. Indeed we do. And now the knight pivots round. Maybe would also be a good idea to push a pawn and try and get the other bishop out as well, because this is moving a developed piece a second time. So perhaps maybe losing tempo, but then the bishop doesn't have too many options of where to go. And here, white decides not to defend the bishop or move it. It's defended by this pawn, so if knight takes now, we're going to have pawn takes and open up a semi-open e-file, which is indeed what happens. Okay. And now e5. So e6, the e5 square is now available to the knight. And if we have knight here and then knight takes, we can recapture with the doubled f-pawn. We get a nice advanced pawn in there. But white decides here to castle. And we have bishop out now looking at this pawn on f4, which is currently undefended. So what do we do with this? Can't be defended with either of the knights. Could be defended with a queen, or also g3 is an option. Another idea potentially is to push f5. And if takes, we can recapture the queen. So let's see what happens. Queen e3. So the queen just moves across to defend the pawn. And black castles, and now knight to d2. We have queen f6. So this is actually adding a second attacker against this pawn on f4. And now c3 does come. So this is slightly weakening for white, because these light squares now, there's no light squared bishop. In fact, neither side has a light squared bishop. But even so, neither bishop nor queen can really capture that pawn. I mean, yeah, we might recapture with the g-pawn, opening up the g-file towards white's king, but it would be at the loss of a piece. So now, queen f5. So what's the queen thinking? She can't really come in here because there's no defense. This knight's too far away and there's no light squared bishop. So slightly confusing move there. Now we have rook a to e1. So we've got a bit of a barrage here on the semi-open e-file. However, the queen can't advance here or here or here because it would just be captured. So now queen into c2. Looking at this vulnerable b2 pawn. The queen's defending this one, but these two pawns are currently undefended. So what's going to happen? Is the rook going to come back across? Yeah, rook comes back across to b1. And now queen a4, looking at the a2 pawn now. So a3 is natural. So now the queen is maybe at some risk of getting caught on the queen side there. And knight to a5, putting itself on the rim. The knight can't easily come to these squares because it will be captured by white's knight. And now white plays knight to g5, and the knight does indeed come in. And now the queen's moving across. Okay, so here we have an immediate checkmate threat on h7. That's something that black has to deal with. Black can't capture the knight at this point. There's no time to do that. So we have also the g-pawn push now on black's side of the board. The difference here is that black has a dark squared bishop, which could theoretically come in here and just help defend these slightly vulnerable squares. And one option here for white could actually be to start to advance the h-pawn and try and attack this g-pawn here. Now the knight pivots back round, now that the checkmate option is has kind of evaporated. Knight could come here. If the bishop swaps itself off, then again we can capture back with the f-pawn and get a bit of a space advantage in the centre of the board. And now we have an exchange of knights, and white chooses to recapture with their knight that's just come back from the king attack, and c5 finally comes. Very thematic move in the London. We have pawn takes, bishop takes. So now the bishop is looking, it's on a diagonal pointing right down towards white's king. That means that also this pawn on f2 is currently pinned. So it'll be interesting to see how white responds to this. b4 is an option at this point, hitting the bishop, and the bishop would have to retreat on one of the diagonals. But it does undefend this pawn, but then the bishop will have to move first. So we have rook from b1 to a1, defending the a pawn, and potentially lining up b4 now. Queen now moves back to a6. Now this is opening up the possibility of a trade of queens. White's queen is undefended on d3, so white cannot allow black to initiate an exchange, so we do have an exchange of queens, and this gives black doubled and isolated pawns now on the a file, which is somewhat weakening. Now we have b4, which is very natural, and now you notice that all of white's pawns are now on dark squares, and that's going to make life somewhat more complicated for this dark squared bishop, because it really is has very few squares to go to now. Only a few squares now available to that bishop. Now knight to b3. At this point I think I would be wary about swapping off the knight for this bishop, because this bishop has now become quite poor considering the layout of white's pawns. We have rook a to d8, so potentially this d pawn is now maybe thinking about making progress up the board, and we do have knight to c5. Now if the bishop swaps off for the knight, that's going to give white doubled isolated pawns on the c file and an isolated pawn on the a file, and we do indeed have a trade-off, which I don't think is really in white's favour at this point in time, because that bishop, like we say, was a little poor. And now rook comes across to c8. Now how does white defend this pawn? I don't see any realistic way of doing so. So we have rook f to c1 and the pawn falls, so now black is a pawn up. Now rook moves to c2. So maybe the idea is to double up the rooks and then push the c pawn. If pawn takes, we can recapture, but that doesn't really benefit white at this point in time. Okay, so we've now simplified down to king and two rooks on both sides. Both sides have weakened pawns. We've got doubled pawns on the f file for white. We've got doubled isolated pawns on the a file for black. And white also has isolated pawns on a and c, so it's not very clear how this is going to pan out. This rook move now, rook a to c1, leaves this pawn undefended, so I'd imagine if rook comes down now, we may have trouble defending that pawn. Rook does indeed come down to b3, pawn to a4, and now I guess rook to a3 would probably win the pawn. So instead of that, black plays their king forward to g7. White does likewise with g2. So we now have a bit of a race. Now this pawn is now looked at by two rooks on either side. So it doesn't really make sense for black to capture. So white now pushes c4. And if pawn takes, we have rook takes, and then that rook from there would actually now be defending the a pawn. So does it make sense for black to capture here? Black does capture, white recaptures, and now this pawn, which was undefended and isolated on the a file, is now defended. And we have an exchange of rooks. Okay, so the situation is that we have all the pawns on the a file are now isolated. We have 4 pawns each side on the king side, but black is slightly better off with a slightly more advanced king, and also the pawns are not doubled. So you'd have to say at this point that black is slightly stronger, but this now offers white the opportunity to trade off their spare f pawn in exchange for black's extra and undoubled e pawn. And if we have takes here and king recaptures, then rook onto the 7th rank would actually have a choice of pawns to go for. Let's see what white does. White now, okay, goes in with a fork. Okay, so we've got the king in check, and the rook is also looking at this pawn on a6. So there's no time now for the rook to come and attack the a4 pawn, because the king has to get out of check. So we have king f5, and now instead of grabbing the pawn, white's rook advances to the 7th rank, which they could have done on the previous move. And now, ooh, okay. Now e takes f4. Now for the pawn to recapture, that would be very weakening for white. But instead we have rook takes f7 check. So black can't recapture or can't capture on g3 straight away. King has to move, and now I think I would have captured with a rook here, because putting the rook there on f4 would have defended the a4 pawn, and it would also have maintained this pawn structure for white. But we have g takes f4. Now the king is maybe running out of space a little bit. The king did make progress towards the center of the board, but now the king has retreated back onto the king side. We have rook takes a7, and now if the rook were to take on a6, then this pawn again is defended. So the situation now is that actually black is 1 pawn up. We have another king move, and now rook takes a6. So at this point now, white is 2 pawns to the better. King comes down again. There's no real risk of the rook coming in here to g3, but the rook might come to h3, but then again it can't capture on h2. So rook comes back now looking at the h7 pawn. Rook advances, black's rook advances to look at a4. However, you have to notice that if white's rook now captures on h7, that actually comes with check, which means the king is going to have to move to g4. I think it's the only legal move. And the rook could then go all the way back to a7. But instead of that, we have a king move. Okay, I mean, everything is relatively safe, although the king now can come down to h3. And how is white going to defend this pawn other than rook takes h7? Okay, rook comes back down to b3, and the king retreats. Rook goes back up again to b4, and now finally we have rook takes h7 check. The king must move to there, and now h3 check, but the king can now capture on f4. However, that would be a mistake, because the king captures on f4. We then have the option of a skewer with rook to h4. The king has to move off the 4th rank, and then this rook would actually fall. So king does indeed capture, and this is an error from white. It really should have come down with the rook here, with the skewer on the king. The king would have to move to the 5th rank, I believe, because he can't come to any of these squares. So that's an error on white's part. King now comes back towards the center of the board. Maybe now this pawn majority on the king side will start to prove its value, because now this rook is guarding the f-file. So the king now cannot come back onto this side of the board. So in theory, white should be able to find a way to push the king and these pawns up here, get rid of the g-pawn. The rook can't easily come in to defend, it can't come there. It could come back to the 6th rank to defend it. But, okay, so we have pawn to a5, and now the rook is looking to capture the a-pawn. Rook now comes across. I mean, another option would have been rook g7 and try and take out this pawn if black gets greedy. And the king moves across again. We have pawn a6, king comes across again. Now the king is too far away from this pawn to be able to save it. So what I would definitely do now is bring the rook back across, abandon this pawn, and make sure we take out black's g-pawn, and we should be okay. Good, it's good to see. And again now, rook takes g6 would skewer the king. King would have to move to one of these squares. We can then swap off rooks, and hopefully... Okay, do we have a trade of rooks? Indeed we do. Okay, and now, this pawn, if you calculate the square, that's the square. Now, if black's king can get inside this square at any point, it can stop. It can catch this pawn before it promotes. But it's the pawn's move, and now the square has become smaller. The king cannot now anymore stop this pawn. So we have some king moves, some pawn moves, and we get a queen. Okay, king moves up again. Now white's king starts to press up. This queen is completely safe because the king cannot approach the queen. King moves across sideways, and now f4. Okay, and now, okay, at this point in time, what we should be doing is actually moving the king in front of the pawn. But we have the pawn move first. But we have a spare queen anyway, so this should be okay. Now the king moves, retreats, and now there's no way of stopping white from getting a second queen, and we should have now a ladder mate really in 2 moves. King moves here now, so queen g7 would force the king onto the h-file, and then queen to h8 would be checkmate. Instead of that, we have the queen moving sideways. Okay, so this actually stops the queens from sliding across each other, but we still should have a quick mate. There is a slight threat of stalemate still at this point in time, but the queen now moves all the way down the other side, and now whichever way black moves, we're going to have checkmate. So good game all round. Definitely a few small errors. There was the clear opportunity to skewer the king and actually win the black rook earlier on in the game, but good game again. 12 minutes left on the clock for white, 14 minutes left on the clock for black, but the most important thing is that white secured the win with a relatively straightforward mate in the end. I think this would have been better to move so that the queens are not on the same rank, because here now there's only 2 legal moves for black, and that would have been a much safer way to convert the win with a ladder mate. But still, OT Milka, congratulations on the win, taking down an opponent almost 200 points higher rated. So there you go. Just goes to show what can be achieved when you keep your nerve and doing what it takes to get enough of an advantage to secure the win. So congratulations, great game. I hope that you've picked up 1 or 2 tips from that performance as well. And again, congratulations, OT Milker. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you haven't subscribed. And I'll see you soon.